IKEA once decided that one night when the store was closed, they would let a bunch of cats spend the night in that IKEA store, and they would record what happened. So initially, the cats were all in their little bags or carriers, and these bags and carriers were unlocked, but the cats were just in there in their little containers. It was all very, very peaceful initially. In leadership training, you might hear the term antecedent conditions. This means that while there's no conflict right now, much like the cats in their little carriers in that IKEA store, the stage has been set for conflict. Think about projects, assignments, or initiatives that you've been involved in the past, where the conditions in place that set the stage for conflict, right? If you look back now, you're like, oh yeah, of course we had this conflict because the scope was really unclear, or maybe, this should have been something I saw as an antecedent condition because we had someone who was on one team and my team, and, there was a potential conflict there, right? So try to think about this as you're walking into your new project or your new initiative at work. Maybe sometimes it's based on the different personalities or behavior styles on your team. So if you're familiar with DISC, you might see the potential for a D style on your team, the decisive dominant behavioral style, to be too pushy, curt, or someone who could try to force their way. And then you might look on over at the S style person on your team, that's the supportive one, and you might see the potential for this person to just say yes to whatevs, right? Perhaps the context in which your project operates lends itself to a whole barrel of communications issues. Well, that's what this antecedent condition, what the first stage of conflict looks like, right? It's peaceful, but the stage has been set for conflict. Lucky you. According to Bell and Hart, there are 8 common causes of conflict in the workplace. Any of these can be brewing in the background as the potential source of opposition or incompatibility. So here are the 8. Number 1, conflicting resources. This is when you're going to be competing for scarce resources, human and otherwise. Number 2, conflicting styles. Merriam-Webster defines style as a distinctive manner or custom of behaving or conducting oneself. Well, I'm going to consider style in 3 senses. First, we'll talk about the individual behavioral styles. PMI does list a bunch of different behavioral and style assessments, and in my videos, I'll keep talking about DISC because I find it to be really, really helpful, and it's also in the public domain. At the heart of it, what you want to know for yourself and what you want to share with your team is that according to PMI, up to 75% of the people you come across will have a style different from yours. When it comes to any style assessment, though, whichever one you choose to use, note that there are no right and wrong styles. Understanding DISC, or the model of your choosing, is going to give you the power to adapt so you could communicate better, negotiate better, face better conflict, and build more meaningful relationships. Different tendencies will come out when we are in these different physiological states, right? Is our body in this extreme stress state? We might not show up above the line, right? We might show up below the line, as they say. And so when we are in that green physiology, that green feather mode, if you watch my last video, then I'm more likely to show up above the line. When our bodies or biological spacesuits are thrown into yellow, then we're going to be more likely to show up below the line. And so we all show up doing the best that we can in our biological spacesuits. D's are wired one way, I's another, S's another, and C's another. Of course, we're all individuals, but I like sharing DISC because it's super helpful. Again, it's in the public domain, and so it just gives you a good guideline of what you might expect from people once you know what their styles are. Each style has its own superpower, so perhaps when these people show up in green, we get the benefit of all these different wonderful qualities. But then sometimes when we overuse or misuse our superpowers, it turns out not to be so helpful or fun. If you're prepping for the PMP exam, DISC is one of the models PMI mentions. They mentioned a few others like MBTI. I think it's the color model. And again, they don't really care which one you use. They just want you to understand that up to 75% of the people you come across are likely going to have a different style than you do. So I know someone who's reading a book called I'm Surrounded by Idiots. Well, of course you're surrounded by idiots. 75% of the people have a different style than you do. So of course they're idiots. I'm just kidding. But let's talk DISC. I'll let you know what each letter stands for, and then what above the line might look like and what below the line might look like. So again, if I am showing up above the line, I show up one way, and that's the way that's positive for the team. If I show up below the line, then that's going to hurt the team's synergy and hinder us. So D, that's the decisive style. Above the line is decisive and straightforward. Below the line is impatient, overpowering, and blunt. I is the influential style. Above the line, socially connected, great empathy. Below the line, overly emotional, overstepping, and making personal attacks. S is the supportive style. Above the line, flexible and supportive. Below the line, gives in, compromises, and withdraws. And C is the compliance style. Above the line, problem solver, fact focus, and below the line, overly critical, defensive, and rigid. So DISC is a good example of thinking about conflicting styles, right? Because you could predict what kind of personality behavioral conflicts you could have if you know the styles of the people you're working with. Now, the second sense of style would be based on culture. So since we're working in a global workforce, conflicting styles may also be tied to culture. And then the third sense of the word style, work style. This could be a cause of conflicting styles as well. So for example, some people prefer to work by themselves, and here we're putting a big emphasis on building a high-performing team that collaborates and promotes visibility. Another example, one person's approach to work, meaning the work method, might be opposite to another's. Now, the third from Bell and Hart is conflicting perceptions. The way people see and interpret the world, events, and experiences is influenced by our past experiences and so much more, as you could tell from this doodle that I made that I'm going to put on screen. And this is a take of Reimagining the Workforce, the Victorian Rolling Stock Context Literature Review, April 2020. And it's based on something from the Diversity Council of Australia. So I took some of their stuff and doodled it. There you go. Number 4 is conflicting goals. This manifests as conflicting goals for an individual on your team. For example, in a matrix organization, someone might report to their manager as well as to you as a project manager. So in some cases, this is like having two bosses. Another example is when working with different stakeholders and different stakeholder groups, each of them will often have their own list of goals. And of course, these goals can position one stakeholder or group against another. Number 5 from Bell and Hart is conflicting pressures. So this is similar to conflicting goals, but it's more about what's happening right now, the pressure on me right now. Merriam-Webster defines pressure as the stress or urgency of matters demanding attention. So the time frame we're looking at here is ASAP, or as one of my old bosses used to say, ASAFP. Number 6 from Bell and Hart is conflicting roles. Sometimes roles are not defined to enough detail, or they're just flat out misunderstood. Oftentimes, someone could be asked to perform a task that they're usually not responsible for. So both the person inheriting the task and the person who should have inherited the task feel this conflict. So here's a scenario that shows how people with different roles and different goals and perspectives when it comes to a potential new project. And I'm just going to kind of role play it with my little fingers over here. And ultimately, the conflict stems from the role each is playing. And that role gives them the lens through which the perspectives and goals are being formed, right? So let's say this is during project initiation, and it's not a really signed, sealed, delivered deal yet. So the salesperson and the potential client are thinking of having a launch in 3 months time frame. So the budget doesn't seem to be all that much. The client over here is thinking, I'm going to get the moon and the stars and the planets, all the bells and whistles, everything in my wildest dreams. And then here's the e-commerce project manager hearing all this stuff about the project, picturing the 6 constraints of scope and budget and schedule and quality and resources and risk, and thinking, well, this must be a really moderately scoped project because it needs to come together in 3 months, and that's not a lot of money. The salesperson is thinking about the money the organization can make or the commission that they can make. They're not necessarily thinking about, what the project manager and what the client's thinking about. The designer over here is thinking about all the cool stuff they could design. The front-end web developer is worried about building out something snazzy while working with an impossible schedule. Like maybe this person over here is giving dirty looks to the designer because they're like, I know what you're thinking with all those fancy things. I'm not going to have time to build it for you. And maybe we have a back-end developer over here being like, I don't hear absolutely anything that lets me know what I'm going to build, right? I have no system specs to go on, and what are you talking about? All right, so number 7 from Bell and Hart, different personal values. So we all have our own personal core values that affect our thoughts and behaviors and help us to focus and align on our own life choices. So these values tie to our ethics and morals. When we have people with opposite values, this could lead to conflict. And Bell and Hart's number 8, unpredictable policies. Policies are not always communicated across the organization effectively, and this could lead to confusion and, you guessed it, conflict. So that's the classic list of 8. It's not an all-encompassing view of why conflict arises in the workplace. The potential for opposition or incompatibility could also stem from a lack of honesty, stress, communication issues, heavy workloads, leadership styles, outright poor leadership, lack of transparency or openness, overlapping responsibilities, competition, contrasting methodologies, even the team structure itself, disparities in the distribution of work, misunderstandings, lack of trust, change, and that could be within your organization or from the external environment. So 1.1.1 has a lot to it. Today I covered the source of conflict part, and in the next I'll cover the stages of conflict part. I didn't want to make this one too long like the last one, so take good care, and I'll see you in the next video.